Oh no, the recording started. Simon thinks this is content.
I mean, everything is. I mean, in fairness, if I'd recorded the last 45 minutes of me and Kim talking, I think I'd have to put it behind a paywall because.
God, I previously obviously noted that the image of Craig is quite revealing. Why Craig?
The name? Why the name Craig?
Yeah.
Hey, why not?
Oh, what's this link go to? Craig.chat. Craig is your friend. Well, okay.
I think I've seen YouTube adverts for that kind of thing.
You can join Craig's Discord server. Wow.
You can, because Craig is your friend.
That must be quite. That's quite a tragic feel. That Discord server, isn't it?
Yeah, who'd have one of those?
I'm now delving into all of the documentation on Craig. Why does Craig need to nickname themselves?
My best friends are all on the Discord server for my favourite tool. How did you meet? Oh, we met through the support page for my Acer. Oh, I mean, like, I'm being mean. There's probably are people like that, but it just has quite a tragic vibe. I got banned from all other social media, so I make friends through
the support channels for discontinued white goods.
Oh, there's a book in that, or like an audio drama.
Yeah.
This is making it the edit. I mean, let's go for something more accessible. Yeah, football. Yeah, they kick the ball well. The Lionesses won. I tuned in for the last few minutes, having watched essentially a pinned score slowly tick up and go, oh, they won. I know it's got to be a random number generator, but it's still very so impressive. But basically, I mean, what this seems to tell us is that England teams can win in Wembley only, and only in years where the last two digits are the same.
That is the kind of discourse and note for which atypical people are well known. We have to tie events to numerology, apparently.
Oh, don't tell me with numerologists. For once, you want to see a numerologist who's like, well, I've calculated the apocalypse, but it's within none of our lifetimes.
I mean, that's perfectly fine. I'm comfortable with that, although I suspect that the apocalypse will be here sooner than that because of, anthropogenic climate change.
Yeah, I listened to a New Statesman long read podcast, be a bit hit or miss, but they did one on the women's game, and they had the person, I think, who wrote the article that was being narrated was I don't actually know if she was on the English team, but no, I think she was just like a kind of semi-professional, like almost like just like a kickabout club, but like I guess that's the point. In sort of women's football, there are just so few professional roles, and they're underpaid, and they often get low priority on getting grounds, and just all these barriers, which are just really depressing to hear, especially when you consider how much more inclusive the women's game seems to be.
And what was rather lovely was
LGBT wise, but just in
yes,
general,
exactly. And that was one of the things which was noted is that a number of the ladies taking part in the England team who won yesterday identify as LGBT and have LGB at least and have same-sex partners and so forth, and there's no problem with it. It's fine. There were more, in fact, openly gay players in the women's team yesterday who won their international game than there are in the entirety of men's professional football.
Wow.
That's very depressing. What are we recording?
Well, this is the thing, is that we have a bit of a bit of a thing here, really. Well, do you know what? It's episode 10. I say let's push forward and do masking.
I can't even find the notes you sent round. Where are the notes you sent round for masking? Hello and welcome to Atypical, the podcast. This is where we discuss and explore life from an atypical perspective. My name is the mysterious voice. I'm not getting away with that this time. Almost said my name. My pronouns are he, him, and I am joined by...
Kim.
Simon, he, they, and...
Kim. She, they. Oh my God. But that wasn't meant
We
to be
have-
the whole. Cut, was
We've
it?
attempted that intro quite a few times, and that is
Yeah,
amazingly
and do you know what?
the
It's the
best
one that's
state.
going into the edit. So, but this is interesting though, because so you're the mysterious voice, and that's kind of a mask, right? Isn't it? You're hiding who you are behind a name, and I think that kind of like launches us into this episode. I mean, obviously, masking is an enormous subject, and we're barely going to scratch the surface this evening. But I think it's worth just sort of touching on what is masking. At its most basic, it's a kind of camouflaging, right? It's effectively where an autistic person will, or a neurodivergent person, or other identities will hide their traits, their identities, to, I suppose, to present themselves as more neurotypical. I mean, we're going to see this most likely in social situations, especially when an autistic person goes into a workplace or a party or a social situation, and they want to try and hide the fact that they're on the spectrum.
Yeah,
and, yes.
absolutely.
So I think we should be upfront here, and I'm going to be maybe potentially a little bit controversial here, because I think that autistic masking is one of those things that's been forced upon us by the way society is built. So when something out of the ordinary happens, we all sort of look at it and we start questioning it. And autistic people, I mean, I don't know about anyone else, I don't like being looked at. And so when people look at you and you can hear them asking, why are they doing that? What's wrong with the person? It's incredibly distressing. Now, I'm not saying that, stimming or not making eye contact and all of the other things that, I do and I know other people do. It's very much a normal part of who we are. But being singled out because of it is incredibly distressing and upsetting. And so we end up masking, we end up forcing ourselves to hide our authentic self. And it's not just autistic people that do this, by the way. It's also people with ADHD, with dyslexia. I have a stammer, which I try very hard to stop doing as well. And, it's so many different conditions that do it. I mean, this is, of course, just, my view. I think that neurodiverse people often feel that they have to present themselves in a more neurotypical way and perform, and I say perform, neurotypical social behaviors in order to fit in with a social group and avoid being like outed or harassed. I mean, especially at school or in the workplace. Again, that's my opinion. What do you both think?
So I feel like for anyone who's not autistic or not neurodivergent, or maybe someone who just is, but they don't really understand what we're referring to, I feel like the best analogy I can think of is if you ever watched kind of the behind the scenes on a film, or like any kind of or any kind of recording like that, you'll often see the actors performing their lines really well, and they are so in character. It's often you actually are like, is this actually going to be a deleted scene? And it's not deleted, but like kind of outtake. Is this actually going to be a take that went wrong, a take where something happened, and then suddenly they'll just lapse out of it, and whatever kind of sinister affect they're putting on, whatever kind of depth of character is there, goes, and they just become the actor again.
Yes.
Although what then happens usually is obviously everyone laughs a lot. It gets, someone makes a note down, or there's a bit on the recording, let's put that in the DVD or whatever. That was a funny moment. If you're autistic, it feels like a threat. It can feel a bit like a high wire rack. Now, in practice, the scenery isn't all going to fall down usually if that happens, but you can feel like if you're trying to present yourself in one way, but you're kind of doing something that takes a higher level of energy than just kind of relaxing into it, there's a kind of a risk that you either suddenly fail to be able to do that anymore because maybe you just can't keep up the act, because you sometimes because it's just too much energy, sometimes because you just don't have the knowledge to keep kind of playing along in the way you're trying to do, or because it's something where you kind of get caught out a little bit. I think that kind of can be a challenge. So I feel like, I mean, the term that gets also used a lot on like kind of stand-up or other comedy things is also corpsing. So it's always, think about how many comedy shows are done where two people have to deliver lines completely deadpan to each other that are obviously meant to be absolutely hilarious to the audience, but obviously the characters themselves aren't going to laugh at that, especially if what's so funny is the fact they're annoying each other. And I always think like there's a sense of corpsing, which is the ability to maintain that the affect of being an actor kind of goes away. And I think that there's a kind of similarity in masking. Now, I think maybe that kind of suggests a too conscious sense of what masking is. And I do think this is something where, like, I always sort of run into a problem with, like, is it just that you have a mask and that there's a genuine you underneath? Or is it that you're an assemblage of a bunch of, maybe not masks, but like traits over time? and actually you can sometimes in a position where your kind of own perceptions and your thoughts about what you want to be or what you want in a given situation kind of get hidden beneath it, or like you kind of maybe just adopt traits you like in others or that you think are good in others, and use them to kind of build a kind of coping strategy to get by day to day.
I think that's absolutely that's definitely something I do is adopt aspects of people I admire and mirror that and sort of replicate it, because it's an effective masking. It's an effective mask, right? If I go into a social situation and I effectively play a character.
Think about what we originally started with, the idea of autistic masking, what it looks like to be autistic. And in my head, I just feel like, I don't know, I mean, we're obviously going to do a whole episode about autistic masking within women and stuff like that, where we might be able to get into this in more detail as well. But like, in my head, I feel like everyone masks to a certain extent. I don't know whether this is really controversial.
No, I think I'd agree with that.
Yeah, and like there's these kind of social constructs that are in the world. Like, for example, when we go to work, it's like, you know, you have to basically come to work and act friendly and be professional, and, you know, no matter what's going on at home. So to an extent, obviously, most people will then kind of just mask and pretend that everything is going okay. And I guess, obviously, autistic masking is kind of a slightly different thing of that. And I think is just that it's much harder as an atypical person to mask, potentially, when those social constructs don't really necessarily make sense. And I think atypical people tend to be a bit more like, well, that social construct doesn't make sense, and therefore why would I keep doing that? Or where emotions and things might be way more overwhelming, it's impossible to mask that completely, and therefore we have to have certain, I don't know, behaviors or whatever to protect ourselves, and those appear atypical then to neurotypical people. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's a degree of which we need to define our terms, gentlemen. Do we mean redistricting or reapportionment? To quote The Simpsons, which you might want to drop in there.
Come on, TV, give me some of that sweet, sweet pep.
Well, let's define our terms, gentlemen. Are we talking about redistricting or are we talking about reapportionment? Because
can't win them all.
Because I think there's a certain degree to which, yes, I think everyone masks. For a certain definition of mask, I think everyone does. If by masking we mean people act differently in different social circumstances, I think that's a quite a normal human thing. I think this might come again back to that. But then I think there's a kind of extension of that, which is, I think it's somewhat about energy levels and about how often you're doing it. So, like, I think there's a degree of, I think most people sort of can struggle with like a new situation. I think there's definitely a challenge we're running into here where you almost do need someone who can kind of speak to what the experiences of not being autistic occasionally.
Yeah, we need a neurotypical person here, don't we?
But like, let's put it this way. I think that if you're trying to, say, like, adapt to being in a new workplace or you're at a wedding or whatnot, I think that's actually probably quite a common thing. I think the difference is probably being autistic is that you aren't necessarily very good at picking up the ways in which that should be done. I think to some extent people often do that relatively automatically, or they're able to kind of, or equally the behaviours that they would normally exhibit are easier to fit within that environment. So you're not necessarily masking to not really cover up, but like kind of disguise as much about things. You don't really have that same sense of kind of being caught out potentially. I mean, there might be other ways in which people feel like they're going to be caught out. I mean, there's plenty of reasons why people share something in an environment or be concerned about a situation. But I do think that there's a particular thing in there about being autistic. I think this can kind of come back to what I said before about the sense of comparing it to, say, come back to the social model, comparing it to being in a country that you haven't grown up in that has a very different culture. And I think you can probably see that if you ever found yourself talking at detail about your special interest, or you've been in a group where you might be in a group where it's generally a bit more neurodivergent, you can occasionally see the reverse situation happening.
Yes,
a neurotypical person isn't quite sure how to respond or engage with that situation, and like they don't really have a mask or an adaptation to that. I mean, they might do. I mean, it definitely depends how much time they spent with other people. Like, I mean, this is ultimately like, I think like with a lot of these things, I think there's an underlying human behaviour that most autistic people also have, and then I think there's a different but overlapping or maybe just intersecting behaviour that's kind of particularly autistic here. And I think that's why, because I know how much we're all a bit aware of everyone is a little bit, or everyone does X, but it sometimes doesn't separate out the specifics.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if that made any sense while rambled, but that was my I think to some extent it's about the level of adaptation and the level of energy. Like I think
And I think
being
that's
autistic is
crucial.
essentially getting knackered from having to mask, or frankly having to mask who you are, which I don't think is just an autistic thing. I think that is very common for a lot of things. Like literally having to for safe. I think there's a degree of if you're masking, there's a difference between masking for embarrassment and masking because you expect serious negative consequences from being open.
And I think that's the really interesting thing there is that because we mask as a form of self-protection. We do it to prevent misunderstandings or even aggression in some cases, but just the level of energy and spoons that it takes is quite something. And you make a good point there, I think, about if you go to a wedding or a conference or an event, everybody there to an extent will be acting slightly differently anyway, so it's easier to go unnoticed. Whereas I suspect that we probably mask a lot more in just day-to-day life.
I think there's a bit of a kind of, I don't know, I think probably because I've got so many different kind of experiences of, like possibly masking in certain ways because of being a woman, masking in certain ways because, I don't know, I'm bisexual, masking in certain ways because I'm, autistic, have ADHD or whatever. I think once you have those different experiences, you still mask to protect yourself. It's just, you're obviously having to do it even more, and that takes even more energy because, you've got even more of yourself to hide. So I just think, I don't know whether I would use necessarily, I don't necessarily want to make this a universal thing where it applies to lots of different things because that kind of makes it more confusing. But yeah, I think I can just see that masking can be applied to a few different things in terms of it still being a protective mechanism. It's still being a kind of thing that requires a lot of energy because you're trying to fit into this kind of social mold that you might not fit into otherwise. And I guess, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think so. And I think that's kind of, that's something that we see sort of in ritualized forms of masking, people putting on or affecting a physical mask or clothing. I mean, we spoke in the last episode, didn't we, about suits and how sometimes you put on a suit and you just act in a different way. You feel different. It's a modern day suit of armor, right?
And I think I mentioned that, like, I think in that episode, I mentioned that sometimes, especially when that you're wearing that outfit to perform a very a relatively straightforward or regimented role, that where it's clear the expectations on you, where it is time bound, it is something where you have a sense that you're part of a larger group or organization. It might be something like a uniform, or it might be something like something you might wear in like an academic context or whatever. I do think that's a form of kind of that's almost like evidence to the theory, which is that it gives you're in a more straightforward situation. The expectations are much more clearly prescribed and actually easier to understand. Now, it's possible
you're playing a role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think that there are levels of masking. So, I think the problem is that the phrase mask sometimes suggests that you're just essentially I think two things. One, it suggests there's a kind of clarity of what's under the mask, and two, it suggests that it is you either wearing it or not. And I think in practice, it's something that adapts to different. You adapt to different situations. I think and also I think you sometimes have the sense you're kind of opening up to people a bit, because I find it's hard to have a particularly close friendship with people when you're kind of feeling like you have to mask or hide a bit. You're kind of keeping back things about yourself.
The feeling for me, and this is why I've got this thing where I refuse to mask around my friends, is because if I do, then I have that deep fear that they're not friends with me, they're friends with the mask.
Yeah. Well, I find I can sometimes be not peel back, but you can you sometimes share a bit, but you don't disclose all. You sometimes actually disclose a version. Oh, there's the real twisted thing sometimes. You disclose a version of you that is autistic, but is a version of autism, which is much easier for people to interact with.
It's an acceptable form. It's autism, but you make eye contact. I'm
not even talking simple about stuff like that, because I actually mean more just there's a difference between being goofy and being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And I think that and I think I possibly hit on something there where people. Do you remember the sort of concept of the gay best friend? That I mean, is definitely something, but isn't kind of historic that. And there definitely is a sense in which, in some groups, you're actually just fulfilling a different role. You're just putting on a different type of mask.
Yes.
Or you're wearing or you're revealing bits of yourself that are kind of fun and a bit wacky. You're not necessarily revealing kind of what you're feeling deep down. Now, that is not just an autistic thing. People do not talk that much about how they're feeling internally. People don't talk about what's troubling them very much. And even if they do, they're often doing it in a way which is itself very kind of closed down, or often talking about things that are ongoing problems as if they are resolved problems, which is the other thing I find. People talk about saying mental health. It's like, oh, yes, because you don't want to talk about something actively, because sometimes you don't necessarily want to be open enough about needing help. And I definitely think you see that if you're a bit into like a work safe space or something like that, you can definitely hear people who are kind of juggling that situation where they're kind of, it's easier to talk about something as a finished story than it is to talk about something where someone else in that room might actively be causing you harm in that moment, or in general, or by their actions or whatever.
Yeah.
So when I first told a friend of the show that we were going to do this episode, that their immediate reaction was to start singing the Masquerade from Phantom of the Opera. I think the exact line was, "Masquerade, hide your face, the world will never find you."
Yeah, I mean, there's also
a very interesting way of taking it.
I was going to say, there's also, and this is potentially to give you an opportunity to segue, Eurovision had the Australian entry, who was literally
that famous European country, Australia.
Yes, who was literally wearing a mask and took it off partway during the song at a very emotive moment. And I thought that was a very good song that was completely ruined by the fact that the UK commentators refused to read their notes. So instead just said, oh, look, he's taking off his mask. And it's like, I mean, I took 2 seconds Googling to find out what this was about, and it's actually quite an emotive song, but you clearly haven't bothered to actually look this up, so you're no more informed than anyone just watching. And it was just like, oh. But in any way, it was a really good song. I thought he did an episode of Ouch, I think it was at the time. It may now be All Access, the BBC Disability podcast. And that was a really, really interesting interview where he talked about his experiences of singing in the past and kind of what drove him to audition with that song. And I thought it was a really good song.
Yeah.
There is it's kind of bit of a history of people wearing literal masks in history and theatre.
There really is. I mean, and this kind of goes back to what I was just saying just now with wearing the suits and so forth, is you're playing a role, you're playing a thing. So I was on holiday in Scotland with a friend of mine, Tom, who's a professor of archaeology, and talking about Star Car, which is an ancient site, and they found these sort of I'm going to use a word if ever you hear a historian or an archaeologist use this word, you know what they're saying is they're not quite sure what it is for. A ritualized antler headdress. Ritual is a whole thing, and the whole idea behind that, and sort of looking anthropologically across the world, is that these were probably used for specific purposes. So you'd use them for dancing before or after hunting to, I don't know, keep the deer gods happy and ensure a successful hunt, or to give thanks. And it's sort of this idea of there being a simple, I suppose, hunting disguise. As much as that seems very unlikely now, with all the different scientific methods and so forth, means that they're probably more shamanic. They are more about allowing the wearer to transform themselves, to put them into a position where they could be seen to be able to communicate with the animals or spirits or their ancestors or whatever it may be. And that sort of transitions through to just the idea of using clothing and literal masks to play a role, to act differently. You know, if you put on a crown, you are the king or queen, you have to act in a certain way, even if that is nothing like who you actually are at heart. And we, even just looking at British kings and queens, we've got quite a few who present themselves in one way and act in a very different way, as it turns out. And I guess that's kind of just sort of the way in which I try and explain it to people, especially my neurotypical friends, who you've both said absolutely right. Everybody masks to a certain extent in certain situations. But trying to explain that I'm doing it all the time or doing it in a very particular way with people, I tend to just say, it's like when you wear a suit. You act in a different way when you're in the office wearing a suit to when you're on holiday in T-shirt and flip-flops. It's just, you do and say things differently because you're fitting into that context. It's just that I think with especially neurodivergent people, the amount of energy required to process that context is an ongoing thing. So you end up creating certain behaviors or masking certain behaviors, I should say, to effectively fake eye contact. And we talked about this way back in sort of episode 1 and 2, if you remember, Mysterious Voice, with Matt, who talks about how they would stare at someone's left ear because it looks close enough to them making eye contact.
Yeah,
You know,
although
this-
I wouldn't focus too much solely on eye contact. I think it's a
No,
broader range
absolutely
of
not. And I
behaviours.
think it's much broader.
I
You know,
actually-
it's
I actually
smiling
genuinely-
and gestures and mirroring
Well-
people in conversation.
To some extent, your mask can become so good that I would say that nowadays I don't have any problems with eye contact, except in very particular, quite emotive scenarios. I actually think a suit is a more useful analogy because I think a suit is assembled.
Yes.
You sort of try on different things. Like sometimes it's kind of like adaptive behaviors in general. I've got a good analogy here. Are we ready for this one? So it's like walking into a room. You have a wardrobe. You put on an item. You walk in the room. Oh, they scream at you. Why aren't you wearing any other clothes? You're only wearing a sock. Go back in. You put on another item. You go back in the room. Oh, you look a little bit closer. Eventually, you get an outfit. And that's an outfit which people give you a slightly odd look. You adapt it, but people are reacting a bit less and less. Now, actually, sometimes that can be the danger because I've definitely found situations where I can make something that works generally, but there are definitely either rare scenarios or ones where there's just no latitude to get it wrong, where actually you never really adapt to that. But also, I think there's another factor to a suit, and that's that fashions change. And I think that's not the best analogy because I think a lot of social things stay relatively static. But I do think you can suddenly be in a situation like, but this worked before. You might go to a different location and people be like, oh, what the hell are you wearing that for? You know, there are different scenarios, and I think
that sort of mode switching between different things is analogous to turning up in morning dress to a simple work meeting. Yes.
Conversely, you can also go, oh, I like how that person carries themselves. That person might be autistic, they might be neurotypical or whatever, and you can actually go, oh, I like that trait about them, or that's something that seems to go well for them. I'm going to adopt that. And I do think that's why sometimes you can have a position where you're not really sure what your kind of underlying preferences are. Now, I'm never that sure because I think that's actually quite human in general. I think people understand what they want, understand who they are through their interactions with others. I think a personality is something you build up over time. But equally, I do think there's a sense to which you can be like, oh, that person wears that metaphorical tie and that seems to go quite well for them. So why don't I adopt that? And
yeah, absolutely, is what I do.
And then and obviously that can have its own consequences. But I think that's perhaps a better analogy. I feel like we're getting a little bit too far from the reality, which obviously we're going to get a little bit in a moment to talk about what kind of things we mean when we say masking. But I think that's maybe a kind of some of the emotive reason why you do it. I also think possibly, and I might pose this, is masking lying. Because I think there's definitely a sense to which a kind of general audience might go, well, you're not showing your real self. And there's kind of two reactions to that. One is, well, you're kind of deceiving me about who you are. And the other one is, oh, you can be open with me. It's absolutely fine. Oh, why don't you share? We're all open here. Yeah. And the former has its problems. The latter also has its problems. The latter in some ways is worse than the former because the former is more out and out hostile. The latter can lead you into positions where in a world that isn't particularly open to difference for certain reasons and so on, you kind of get people to kind of go, oh, show me something, and then actually that's not necessary. This is the problem. Sometimes masking is a perfectly rational strategy, and unfortunately,
it's a protective mechanism.
A consequence of a crappy world. Anyway, I've dumped a lot into the conversation there. Have at it.
There's a lot to take on. I feel like my brain's trying to reconstruct what I think about masking, because I feel like I've got two thoughts of it at the moment. There's the kind of masking when the kind of masking which is kind of these are the little social cues that I need to do in order to fit in with the world, which is the kind of like stuff that's like I think okay to do. It like maybe takes a bit of spoons, but it's all right. It's like the asking people how the weather is and the kids are, and you might not care, and you might be just like, I don't really care about this stuff, but this is the stuff that gets me along in life. But then there's the masking, which is like absolutely required because you have like a massive meltdown, or basically someone is like really like pushing your buttons, and like like for a neurotypical person that might be just like that's a really annoying, but for like someone that's atypical, you might just be like, right, that is like a real trigger for me, or that's really I'm gonna like just completely lose it and I'm gonna have to punch something or something. And in that case, like you absolutely have to mask because it is not acceptable.
100%, yes.
To suddenly have a meltdown and scream out loud or punch something or whatever. So I think my brain is kind of just going, there is just these. It's not. I don't know. I don't want to be like it's a spectrum.
Well, no, I don't think you're wrong, though. It is.
Where it's like, these little masks, like everyone kind of does them, and like they're probably a bit harder for atypical people. But then there's the like, no, but these are the ones that neurodiverse people have to do because like the behaviors, I think, as like the Mysterious Voice touched upon, is like, if we didn't mask, then it would be completely dangerous for us, and like people could call the police, or like people could, I don't know, call security, or you could get like sacked or something like that, because like that behavior is not acceptable in like a work context or in the, I don't know, middle of the public or something like that, because they don't understand that you might have to process things in a certain way in order to like, I guess deal with it.
Always wearing a base state mask at all times.
Yeah.
And I guess that's sort of like part of what that is about things like mimicking gestures and hiding your personal interests. Or I mean, do you have almost like rehearsed responses to things? Derail that moment of meltdown long enough to get away from the people around you, and that is the mask. Is the you slip from the I am doing this version of Kim into survival mode Kim.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think again some of this touches upon the whole kind of being a woman as well. And I think there's the kind of I do a lot of like people. I am a naturally like kind of quite chatty, bubbly, smiley, like giggly person, but like I definitely use that sometimes as a defense mechanism when someone like really upsets me and I can't lose it, so I just smile and nod, and I generally just withdraw into myself and I just sort of switch off. But I'm just kind of like, I might laugh and smile, and like people think it's okay because I'm doing that, but in actual fact in my head I'm just like trying to like not have a meltdown. So
yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's really important actually is to start recognizing those behaviors. And it's not so much about being able to just take off the mask, because if we do, the response may not be something that we can then handle, because we're masking for a reason. It's so much more than simply choosing the right words or the right body language or clothing or the options. It's being able to quickly process huge amounts of effectively really complex data. What's that person doing? Are they smiling? Are they standing up? What's the expectation around here? What's the environment doing? And it's monitoring how all of that changes and repeatedly and seamlessly trying to adapt to it. And the huge amount of energy required to do that means you have to have a couple of, to my mind, like scripted responses to things to make sure you don't have that meltdown. You don't accidentally allow the mask to drop in such a way or a place where you are going to end up being, I don't know, bullied for it or threatened for it, or put in a situation where you're not safe.
I definitely feel like a lot of my masking, which I feel is why it's been so difficult to even sometimes, when you're like going through the diagnosis process of going, what are your like kind of masking behaviors or whatever. A lot of mine I feel are very like hidden. Like, I tend to bite the inside of my mouth, or like, I tend to like clench my like fingers and stuff like that. And just stuff that like, I don't know, doesn't seem that very obvious to people necessarily. So, they're just...
You minimize the stimming behavior, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and, it's not, like someone can't necessarily tell if I'm like biting the inside of my mouth generally and stuff like that. So it's just, yeah.
I mean, I've sort of developed a number of for want of a better term, tics, where in order to make it look like I'm not particularly stimming. I mean, and some people have noticed it before. I mean, one of our regular co-hosts, Joey, notices when I do it particularly, is that if I'm quite distressed, I turn my head slightly and I'm pulling on my left ear in a sort of, I'm thinking about what you're saying. This is a really interesting kind of way, sort of like stroking the chin kind of thing. Or I rub my hands together a lot as if I'm sort of processing what I'm going to say next, listening to you, because I've taught myself, rather than clicking or snapping or whatever it might be, is there are certain behaviors which are acceptable in polite society, and if it's something like scratching the back of your ear or just gently sort of your thumbs twiddling, it is like, yeah, that's fine. There's nothing going on there. Whereas if I'm sat there with my foot tapping incessantly, and then lots of people do that because that is a stimming behavior. Sitting there tapping your foot is a stimming behavior, and so trying to find those things that still allow out, it's a pressure relief valve, right? because the sheer amount of energy required to act up to societal expectations is enormous. Atypical people will probably be putting a huge amount of work in to match up to a neurotypical expectation of whatever that expectation may be. And the drive to be accepted within that social construct takes an enormous toll on both, I think, our mental and our physical health. And so when we get told, "Oh, you don't need to mask around us," being able to make that decision and process that information and decide if it is safe and to what level we unmask. Do we just take off the outer one, that outer onion?
When you said about what you said just then, my brain just went to, "Don't worry, Homer, we're from the land of chocolate. We're German, we're from the land of chocolate." And then I realised that's actually a very good analogy, because Homer proceeds to have a massive fantasy and a dance about being in the land of chocolate, and then he comes back to reality to discover the 2 German owners of the nuclear plant now staring at him. And actually, accidentally, that's a very good analogy. So he lets his guard down, and then they're like, "This guy's really weird." I'm
going to make Homer prancing through the land of chocolate the episode art, I think.
God. So, oh dear, I'm already trying to do something that slightly deconstructs how this pod works. Right. Dear listener, the reason I've been quiet for the last little bit is because I stepped away to sort out something where I live. And I was able to hear Kim and Simon, so I basically queued up a few things which I'm now going to insert. And in that very autistic way, I essentially having queued up a bunch of topics, it always reminds me a little bit of that SKCD comic about people watching YouTube and being like, "I know what they want to listen to next. I'm going to dump my immediate thoughts on some very quick things which I heard while listening in on my headphones." So, first one, I think a really simple one. One of the challenges you actually can find, especially when masking, is, so like, say you're saying like, you're saying you don't really enjoy saying like, "Hi, how are you?" That kind of small talk. I find the biggest problem is sort of like having a third or fourth comeback, because sometimes you can be like, "No, this isn't how this works. You have to give me something to go on. That's what I've learnt to do. You have to give me something to like reply on." And sometimes people just give you absolutely nothing for a conversation to go on. You're like, "Okay, so I've asked, how are you? What are you up to? How's your work? You're really giving me nothing here. You've just basically the equivalent of fine to every question, and I don't know you well enough to have a more conversation on this."
It's a sequential thing, isn't it? It's like, oh, right, they've asked question 1, answered 1. They've asked question 2, answered 2. They've asked question 3, answered 3. Where's question 4? I need question 4 before I can move on.
Yeah, but it's also like a cooperative in conversation, cooperativeness. Yeah. I definitely think like in the reverse, I find that because I'm so conscious of those situations when I'm on the other end of it, I actually, unless maybe I'm feeling like I really don't want to have a conversation with someone, I will generally try and give some string for people, which sometimes means I think I reveal a little bit too much about like, things that actually in theory should be embarrassed. Like, sometimes you reveal your weekend plans and people are like, you did what? You went and did what? But like, you can be like, "Oh, I went and did X or Y." And like, you're a bit like, maybe I didn't need to actually say that, but I said it just so that the other person would have something to say. And therefore you don't actually learn that much about the other person. Okay, that's number 1. 2, I've definitely found this today. I think that like one of the things with masking is that masking, I think, is inherently quite a cooperative activity. So like if you're masking, it's really hard to be assertive, or rather masking generally suggests a lack of conflict. So I had a situation today where I absolutely had to essentially assert, "This is what we're here for," and effectively reject an answer I was being given. That is a really hard thing to do on masking. It's something that leaves you extremely feeling on edge. I spent the whole time after the meeting, frankly, going to other people, as subtly as I could. "Oh, I let my frustration out there." And it's like, the reason I'm doing that is because I'm really hoping they give me a really clear idea on whether I actually did that well or not, because that's not something you get much practice on. And frankly, masking is normally a cooperative, quite minimizing activity in some ways. And actually having to sort of assert yourself is almost the like exact opposite of that.
Yeah, I've found being assertive really tricky in my whole life, to be honest. But again, I don't know how much of that is being a woman and how much of it is just like trying to figure out how to, fit in with society and then not, I don't know, say the wrong things.
Yeah, I feel like it's the kind of play on your mind for days, how you handle the situation. And the other person doesn't even think about it.
Oh, God, yeah.
Inadvertently, they're in your head. It's really frustrating.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are a pro-tangent podcast, but I'm going to haul you back to your list.
Let me get to my list. Oh my God, let me get to my list is a very autistic sentence. Let me get to my conversation topic list. Okay.
Allow his come back to my conversation topic list. The
This is-
approved
this-
conversation topic. And
Here
this
is something we will
pro
come back
list.
to.
Pro list.
Okay, something we might want to come back to when we talk about personality tests or the autism quotient, which I have my problems with. I know it seems to be popular amongst some people, but I'm not particularly keen on it. I think there's definitely a sense of masking during diagnosis and when filling out surveys. If in general, when people fill out medical things, I think there's definitely a type of personality which sort of plays down symptoms or doesn't know quite how to like respond to that.
Yes, I absolutely. I think that's definitely something we'll have to come back to in our upcoming episode on things like personality tests, the autism quotient, and, well, I guess also it'll be covered again in diagnosis. A lot of this stuff is obviously going to come from diagnosis. It's something we're all trying to avoid talking about today, I think, because obviously masking and diagnosis is a big part of it, right? Anyway, you've still got a list, right? Anything left on the list?
Yeah, no, I think I'd sort of relate that to, I think what I've said before, my analogy that, so this is the idea of kind of like freezing up in space because you're not quite sure how to react to a situation. It can feel a bit like the idea of being autistic is not having the sort of GPU, like, graphics processing unit for a computer, but let's call it like a social processing unit that everyone else has. And so you can still handle
I like
those
the idea of
situations.
that.
But you're running it on your like normal processor. So like if a computer doesn't have a graphics processing unit, it can do graphics, but it's not optimized to it and it knackers it because it's obviously using a lot more of its like day-to-day performance. And so if you're in a situation where like you are being told news in the moment or you're reacting to a social situation, you can often feel like you're in a bit of a high wire act where you're not quite sure how to process it and you're kind of like sort of spinning your wheels a bit going, oh no, how do I react? Gotta keep looking normal, got a mask. I don't want people to notice that someone's told you some really bad news or something that for you personally is a really bad thing, but other people wouldn't even think twice and it would be completely normal. Like things to do with food or things to do with like social situations or whatnot. And you can just be sort of like trying to sort of spin your wheels and kind of keep afloat while you're sort of like trying to work out how best to react to that. And I think that can be a very fun situation to be in.
That's really some really good stuff there, which we'll probably have to come back to in a future episode. Thank you for that mysterious voice. I'm just thinking it might be really interesting for our listeners for us to explain why we mask and then go into talking about how that could look in other people. What do we reckon? Kim, are you happy to go first?
Ooh. Why do I mask? God, it's quite a difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because I feel like it's one of those things that you clearly started doing when you were really young and therefore you've just sort of continued doing. But I guess, yeah, because of a protective mechanism to stop getting negative repercussions for certain behaviours which are deemed unacceptable to society. Yeah, that's my answer.
What about you, mysterious voice?
Basically the same. I have a sense of justified or not of risk. I sometimes have a sense of, I think the problem is we often talk about it as more of a conscious activity than it is. It is a kind of, you've almost got being autistic and then you have a separate layer which you've developed over time that sits atop it and that isn't because you're autistic, but it's kind of secondary thing that's come out of it. It's like in the same way that I think people, I don't think it's caused, well, it's not caused directly by it, but I think it's the experience of existing in society that creates it. And I think it's actually something I'm not that conscious of broadly. It's a sense of, is it not wanted to be found out? I will talk about this when we talk more about disclosures and stuff at another time, but there's definitely a sense throughout my life where I've been more and less open with people. And obviously when I feel like I'm wanting to be less open about being autistic, I will generally try and hide traits that make it visible, which can be very difficult when there's some traits that are just quite hard to hide, or where for sensory reasons or for just lack of experience reasons, there's just not really an option to do. So I think sometimes masking can be, you mask all you can in an attempt to kind of downplay or hide the things that are kind of harder to hide. It hides maybe a broader sense of some of the issues you can have existing in society. We live in a society. I really want to do that.
Live in a society.
I mean, George Costanza is a very neurodivergent. Let's not get into diagnosing, but
For me, I think the primary driver behind it, for me, is fear. I'm afraid a lot. And that's not, in terms of physical risk. It is, I suppose, a fear of not being able to fit in, a fear of not being able to contribute, and a fear of being marginalized and minimized. Not being allowed to be my authentic self, because I'm not just Simon. I'm not just that autistic bloke over there. I'm not just someone who looks amazing in a suit, but I'm also someone who has all of these things and much more. It's that intersectionality thing, right? But the masks I wear them a lot. And I think I said earlier on, I try very, very hard. I consciously try not to mask around my friends. And I have a few friends who I can be pretty much entirely naked with. And yet part of my brain is left thinking, is there still a mask I wear around them? Is there still like the last, the t-shirt I wear underneath everything else? Is that still there? And I don't know if it is. I don't know if I've actually been able to fully unmask or not. And I'm kind of afraid of that question as well, is should I completely unmask? And if so, how?
I don't think I can.
I don't think I can either.
Things become so embedded in us. We've learned this from such a young age that it's unlearning something which is almost as natural as breathing.
Yeah. I think there's also.
So we're already running.
I think,
so to use your computer analogy, we turn on and all of the startup programs load in. We can't get into the startup thing and just turn off, Steam from updating. We can't, and iTunes and all those other things, they just load in. And that just takes away some of our processing ability because we've just automatically got that mask on and we can't stop it. It's Java wants to update every time.
Yeah,
there's a reference for you.
I think Planet has had it. There's also like a question of how much would you ever seriously want to unmask? Because I think in a world where like most of the experiences that are there to be had, like interaction with people, come from, or at least you have a sense like you're going to get more out of life if you just mask. I think it's not. I actually don't think it's necessarily as easy a selling thing. I think we mask in maybe the general, and then we unmask in the specific. So, like in contexts like this, or when you're meeting with like small groups of friends, you often are in those contexts open, and I don't think that's unusual. I mean, like people don't confess all their innermost fears in general, like to groups of people. As I say, I think there's a risk in talking about this that we end up being like this is a distinct and special thing, and I think that's always a risk about autism. Is we can sometimes. I think that's sometimes
we have the same thing when we talk about imposter syndrome, though. By the very means of talking about it, we then go, actually, are we even qualified to talk about this? Everyone gets it. Oh no, or is it just me? I don't think we need to say that. I mean,
to remind myself, my favorite Reductress headline: "Take this quiz. Are you even good enough for to have imposter syndrome?" Which I just absolutely love. I think the main thing I want a sort of neurotypical listener to take away, and it comes back to that lying question, is it can sometimes be a strategy actively chosen, and if someone takes down the mask, it is in some ways like it's pretty frankly it's a privilege, and don't take the out of it, because you may have a consequence on that person who may have wanted to be more open with you and then doesn't do that in other contexts. And equally, it may also be that someone decides they don't want to be open, and that's perfectly fine too. Anything like that.
Yeah.
So why do we mask, and how do we mask? What's some of the common things people might see? What could masking look like?
Yeah, so I think we've touched upon certain things. I think we've probably mentioned a few times the most stereotypical one, which I think comes out when most people think of what autism looks like, and that is the kind of, I guess, not making eye contact, or almost the kind of flip reverse of that, of kind of like really then kind of like, that's the kind of like typical, I guess, autism.
So obviously, and I have my own problems with this, but one of the kind of stereotypical autistic behaviours, as usually talked about, is the idea that you don't make eye contact. And I think actually this is where one of the earliest types of masking you can see in people who making eye contact. Now, this almost feels like, I was making the analogy earlier about putting on an outfit. This almost feels like the very first step where you've learnt the lesson, you've learned how it kind of adapts in, but you've kind of overlearnt it. So you sometimes get people who like very much force eye contact or kind of fake eye contact.
No, I think that's right. I mean, and not only is it about that eye contact thing, is do you find yourself also like trying to work out people's facial expressions? Should I be smiling, or should I like imitate the way they, if they're looking, thoughtful, should I imitate that? Or if they're smiling a lot, should I smile? I'm never entirely sure. A lot of the time you can pick up cues from the context and everything else, but especially with a lot of people, they're not giving away a lot of information for me to work on. Is this supposed to be a happy thing? Is this a sad thing? Should I be?
Yeah, and I'm always sort of thinking, having to take a look around and see, oh, okay, people are looking interested in this bit, and they're kind of like tilting their head, so maybe we sort of need to start mimicking kind of the way they're moving their head, because this is a point where we're supposed to look interested. That's what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, it's think mirroring is the term, isn't it? Is when you're in a conversation with someone.
Mirroring, people often say like, oh, if you fold your arms, someone else fold their arms. It's like there's like a reason you're doing that, or like it's kind of people like mimicking each other. I've definitely found situations where I've been like, oh, I seem to be doing the same pose or gesture as someone else. I think I should change it because I'm not sure how people will read it. And that oh god, that's a mind screw.
It is a bit, isn't it?
Because you're like, oh, I'm not sure what this means. Other people noticing? Is this just something that is subconsciously there and you're just sort of doing it to sort of fit in, or what? But yeah, you can find yourself doing that.
Any other masking behaviours?
Yeah, there's the kind of hiding or minimizing personal interests, which I don't know. I don't know. I definitely probably do, but I also don't like the fact that that's potentially considered a masking behavior, because I'm kind of like, I mean, I obviously really enjoy talking about personal interests, but there's definitely people where you start talking about it. For example, every time I seem to mention my PhD, and then people just zone out, and I have to just be like, oh, okay, backtrack, like, let's make this really basic. And I'm just like, I did a PhD in bacteria. And then I'm like, okay, let's move on to something else. Whereas in my head, I'm like, oh, yes, I did this research and it was about bloodstream infections and I did loads of genetic mutations and it was so interesting, blah, blah, blah. And then like 3 hours later, the person is like, I don't know, killed themselves. Okay, that's a bit dramatic. The person
you're doing the bit out of Airplane where you're telling people about your relationship. No, you're absolutely right. It's that wanting to, for me, and I have to reel myself back in because there's lots of stuff I'm really interested in. I want to tell people because I want to share it with them because it's interesting and amazing. And it's like, hang on a minute, no, they're glazing over. I'm doing that thing now. They're going, nope, and it's one of those things I have to really consciously stop myself from doing. Sorry, I interrupted you, Mysterious. Go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a funny one with personal interests because you can either find yourself kind of downplaying and dismissing them. Oh, that's a bit weird. I do that. Oh, a little kind of sheepishness about it. You don't necessarily show the kind of full enthusiasm you have because you feel very self-conscious about people's reactions to it. Because this does tend to be probably the thing that's sometimes hardest to mask is actually your interest in things. But there's another version of it, which I think is where you operationalize, practicalize it. You have the personal interest, but you only reveal it in ways that are like useful to a given situation and where people can be like, oh, actually, you sort of, really know about that. That's been really helpful in the situation. Or it can be like a work context where you can be like, yeah, I just know all this because I picked up over time. I do definitely think this is the kind of context where someone either consciously or unconsciously may pick up on you being autistic.
Yeah, and I think as we were saying earlier on, just the fact that you might sort of develop a bit of a kind of rehearsed responses to particular questions, so that I think we discussed about how, when you're having small talk with someone that you don't really know, you have kind of like 4 questions in your head that you go to. So you don't even have to think about it. You don't really have a lot of spoons to necessarily just go through those from 1 to 4. And that will like at least eat up maybe half an hour or so before you can move on to something else.
Which can actually, I sometimes find that makes me feel quite like callous or uninterested in other people's lives. Whereas I genuinely do care about other people a lot. But sometimes you can have a sort of feeling of your reaction to someone's question was, yeah. Or like actually someone does bring up something quite like deep and you're kind of going for a bit of a rehearsed thing and you sort of possibly get the opposite version of what people get when they say something to an autistic person and they are incredibly open about it because you get to have that experience with someone else's situation. And sometimes you can be like, oh God, I actually probably didn't react very well to that because you just don't know how to react suddenly to someone telling you some extremely like maybe bad news or whatever. Which can always be very fun.
There's a whole thing about how actually people react to bad news. I think that's definitely something we can touch in greater detail because certainly I know that when my father passed away rather suddenly, or I say suddenly, it was kind of expected, cancer and all the rest of it. I found out later that members of my family had criticised me for not being upset enough about it. And it's because I'd just shut down entirely. It's like, nope, too much emotion, can't deal with it. And it took me a long while to be able to open up and process those emotions. But for a while, it just looked like I was cold and uncaring was the exact phrase used by a member of my family who should know better.
Yeah.
And I think actually just, how you respond to things and our emotional response to them, especially when we are neurodivergent, will sometimes be otherwise than how neurotypical people might expect them to be. I have dealt with people who are exceptionally happy about a thing, and I'm just like, okay, great, fine. I don't think that is great, but I'm happy that you are happy. But I can't bluff emotion. It's one of my failings. Is I find it very difficult to bluff emotions.
Yeah, for sure. I think I just did it there. Sorry. I think I just
You
literally
sound
did it in that
interested in me. Oh.
I was interested.
I think I probably did.
Unfortunately, that was. Is it really bad that I was both really like sympathetic and being like, yes, I absolutely understand that, because I mean I don't think that's just an autistic thing. I think not reacting the way you expect to grief is in itself one of the challenging things about grief that I don't even think is just an autistic thing, but I do think is affected by the kind of masking sense, because you're very conscious you're not performing how people are expecting you to react to such a bad situation.
My best friend has ADHD and autism, and I entirely on the same wavelength. I understand that their reaction to certain things is going to be in a particular way. I don't expect them to respond in ways that I might anticipate other more neurotypical people might respond to. And there's a great comfort to kind of just knowing that I don't have to worry about their response to stuff, is because the context of they'll tell me. Simple, it's done. I don't have to go through all of that trying to understand what color and motion and all of those emotional things are.
Yeah.
Anyway,
sure.
I think that's definitely something we could discuss at great length. Are there any other things,
yes.
Perhaps? Go on. I can hear you've got something you want to tell us about, Mysterious. Come on, tell us.
One thing I definitely find is scripting conversations. I will play out a whole conversation in my head, and what I want to say, especially in going into any high wire situation. You know, and actually I think things can go very wrong when either things go off script or where you haven't had a chance to kind of prepare. I find that when I present, I will sort of rehearse it to myself what I'm going to go through. That can sometimes, I think, make my presentations sound a bit stiff, because I'm very conscious that I've had to feel like I've prepared it, so I know exactly what I'm going to say. But equally, I just everyday conversations, I can find myself going like sort of running through what I want to say. Now, again, I don't think that's necessarily a fully autistic thing. I do think a difference in scale is a difference in kind. And I think that's probably true for a lot of these things. I don't think these are all completely unusual behaviours. I think probably most people have some elements of some of these that they do in day-to-day life. But I do think this sort of just the scale of it is perhaps what makes the difference.
That's something I used to do a lot of in the past, but it meant that also I'd end up just not really ever talking at all. I feel like probably something I don't do as much now. But yeah, for stuff like presentations and things and really big conversations, and that's definitely something I do, which I don't know, can be useful, can be not so useful, but I just mostly agree with it. It's a thing.
I do the scripting thing, but for me, a lot of my scripting thing is about trying to anticipate those follow-ups to things. Do I have enough information to be able to cover all of the potential follow-ups to what this may be? But I also try and script ahead all the time, because it's a learned response to having a stammer. There are certain words, phrases, terms of things which I know will trip me up, and then I'll get into a loop where I can't break out of it. And whilst you, dear listener, probably won't hear too much of it because I'm getting better at the editing, certainly, my friends and my fellow podcast hosts here will know that I do make breaks in my conversation, which I suppose they do sound relatively natural, but as much as anything else, half the time it's me running ahead with the next 3 sentences on the lookout for things that could break me.
Let's put it this way, we both definitely have different radio voices to what we have when we're talking casually, because I've definitely noticed we both me and you, and I think Kim, although I'm not as maybe attuned to it, I've definitely picked up with yours, Simon, that we definitely have distinct voices that we do. And I think that's its own kind of performance. And I think maybe that's a thing we should touch on another time, is talking on a mic is an interesting experience. But let's not go too far down tangents. There's also things which obviously we'll talk about a lot more another time, like you can find yourself having to mask your reactions to things. So if you're experiencing kind of a lot of sensory discomfort, like loud noises or movement in the background, or your ability to take everything in has maybe kind of really narrowed down, your masking can perhaps in some ways also become a lot more not so much limited, but a lot more flat. Your kind of affect can become a lot more flat. If a lot has happened, that could be a real challenge. And the final thing I think we might want to mention is kind of the idea of also that, so we'll talk about stims another time, but if you're autistic, stims can be quite hard to control. I often find myself going to do some kind of stim or some kind of reaction, and I will become conscious of it like shut that down, but then it'll just happen again a few months later, especially if I'm feeling agitated.
Yes, stimming behaviours. So stimming behaviours is the obviously autistic thing or neurodivergent thing, I don't know, which I think to some extent people have a little bits of, but the kind of, I guess, trying to think. So there's disguising stimming behaviour. So there is at the moment I'm doing a lot of kind of tapping and things, so probably wouldn't be doing that if I was in a meeting with people, but I do often play with a pen because I feel like that seems like a more acceptable thing until the pen explodes and then goes everywhere, which has happened numerous times to me. Doodling I tend to do a lot of, or writing in a meeting. I'm never in meetings now, but when I was in meetings, I feel like that's acceptable because people are like, oh, they're making notes, but I'm mostly just like, da, 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 just trying to keep moving because it's too still and I need to move.
Yeah.
And I think things I said earlier was like kind of the less visible things, like having to like bite the inside of my mouth. I do a lot of tensing, which is why my body is always so tense, is because I like basically end up tensing my stomach and tensing my hands and tensing my neck and everything, which seems to help me control things, but just leads to a very tense body.
So kind of what I'm picking up from here is I guess we kind of want to talk about what happens if we stop masking, and I think I'll probably ask you both about our experience with that shortly. But I was in the hellscape that is Twitter the other day, and I saw that somebody mentioned that when autistic people stop masking, they get treated terribly because people hate difference, and this got me thinking is that we don't mask for fun. As we've been talking about, we learn to do it through experience. It's something some of us have learned since before we can remember. And we do it because we've learned that if we don't, we experience bullying, we will be othered or some other kind of, dehumanizing treatment. Now, like I say, I try very hard not to mask too much. At work, obviously, I do to a certain extent. There are some things I still won't say at work, although my boss is very supportive and encouraging and usually understands if it occasionally slips slightly and I say or do something which is maybe slightly out of the norm. But I've been very open with my team and tell them that I am neurodivergent. And I've even spoken to my entire department about it before, because I think by doing that, I'm kind of pushing myself into a position where, although I'm not unmasking, I'm making it clear sometimes that I am. But anyway, to others, I think what I would say is if you do encourage us to unmask, not be there masked up, or tell us it's not needed in your company, then damning hell, you need to be ready to put your money where your mouth is and prove to us that masking isn't necessary. Don't be taken aback if actually we start stimming more or speak out differently, or stop making that bloody forced eye contact. No one should have to change who they are to please another person or a group, right? And I think this is something we've talked about in pretty much every episode we've done so far, is that employers, friends, family need to learn more about who we are, and they need to be open and accepting of the fact that we have been playing a character up till now and we want to let some of it go. If all the world is the stage, then all of our clothes is identities, and I just want people to be able to see me. Has anyone else had an experience of unmasking?
Yeah, and I'd say, I feel like I've done that my whole life, but I'd also say, come back on what I said earlier, that someone may just simply not unmask or may not know how, and you might unveil a bit of yourself, but it's not a deception, and it's not something that we're doing because we don't maybe appreciate someone or because someone doesn't mean something to them. And I think that's where definitely that people treat friendship as being genuine, being open, and that isn't always an option in practice. Or it might be that someone is willing to kind of let their mask down a bit in some ways, but not others, even with very close friends. I definitely have friends who I'm very close with where I might not say literally everything, because there's a barrier. There's a mental barrier to doing so. That's probably the mask.
Him.
I don't know whether I can say anything else now. I don't know.
That's fair enough.
I'll skip it.
We'll skip that. That's fine. It's getting incredibly late, and I think all of us are a bit tired, and the weight of wearing our masks all day is weighing down on us. So I think I'm going to bring this episode to a close. Any final thoughts from anyone?
I think the one thing I always think is the sign that you're very good at masking is that classic question you can ask yourself when you're autistic. Am I really autistic? Because sometimes your mask is so good that it actually kind of disguises your ability to really perceive but you are on a day-to-day basis. Like I do have moments where I do that, and then I have moments where I'm like, yeah, I definitely am. There's nothing else that this could possibly be.
I've met you. You are.
Yeah, that's the but that is. I mean, that's just the internal voice, isn't it? Internal monologue.
Yeah. Final thoughts from me, and this is such a huge topic. We'll come back to bits and pieces of it in later episodes. But I guess it's just about reminding people that autistic masking is not something we choose to do. It's not, you asked earlier on, is it about being a lie? I don't think it is. It is not something we use to achieve an unnecessary goal. It is a necessary evil in order to be able to communicate effectively with neurotypical people. And unfortunately, it's unavoidable in situations where nobody wants to meet us halfway. So we have to do it in order to be able to attain that surface level acceptance. And as I said earlier on, atypical people work so hard to match up to neurotypical societal expectations. And that masking to be accepted is a huge amount of energy expenditure. It uses so many spoons. And this is all to the detriment of our own mental and physical health, our own development. And I should also add that, dropping that mask, as I hope I outlined, is really difficult. And for some people, they've got no choice but to mask, because to unmask the risk and the fear behind that, what will it do to your job, your family, your safety, your life, is too much to be able to contemplate and to cover off. So I guess to round it off, masking is an invaluable but draining tool that neurodivergent people are forced into using for many life situations. And I think that when you wonder why an autistic person, and that might be you, dear listener, is drained and burnt out, the masking obligations might actually be the cause of that. So just, I don't know, try and be gentle and understanding, both of yourself and others who might be having to use a lot of energy in order to feel like they fit in. I want to thank both my co-hosts for joining me this evening. This has been a very long episode, and while I found it both emotionally rewarding, it has been draining talking about some of these things.
Yeah, it feels like one of those kind of fundamental building block episodes.
Well, episode 10, it has to be, really.
That we're going to come back to as a topic, probably in a lot of other situations.
I think because it underlies so much stuff.
Yeah, and I think it also underlies the difference between the underlying concept of what autism is and the day-to-day experience being autistic. And I think one of the big reasons why people often misunderstand what that is or get surprised the way autistic people actually act in practice is because people don't understand how much masking is going on and how that's a factor, or maybe they haven't really necessarily put into words what that is before.
Yeah. Kim, any last thoughts?
No, nothing from me.
Okay. Well, thank you both again. Like I say, it's been one of those. So thank you, Kim.
I think it's quite. I think it's quite an apt way for a podcast. I'm asking you to go. We're all a bit knackered and want some time for ourselves at the end of it. I think actually we've somewhat proven our point.
I need to put my mask back on.
Not necessarily mask back on. It's kind of just lie somewhere without your mask on at all. No one to bother you.
Stand up. I just feel like I've been sitting down for. So I don't like sitting still for a long time. And
I've been standing for the last half an hour. So
right.
Yeah.
Let's give Simon the chance to wrap up the podcast.
I need to do an outro.
Okay.
So thank you for listening yet again to us ramble about all things masking. I hope you'll join us in our next episode. I haven't decided what it's going to be yet, but I will put it up in the show notes by the time this goes live. Thanks again to Kim.
Thanks. Bye.
And also to our mysterious voice, who one day we may unmask, and we'll discover he's Zorro.
That was a bit of a threat. Thanks for listening.
I said may. It was done in a nice way. Thank you all, and have a great weekend. Cheers now. Bye.
Bye.
We've finally done our tequila.
Lovely. Done. Do you know what? I'm calling that in the can. Hi, this is Simon in post-production. As you may have realised, that was an incredibly long episode, and you could probably hear it in our voices by the end of the recording. We did talk for over 2.5 hours, and it has taken me pretty much all week to try and make sense of it. So I hope you have enjoyed it. As ever, if you have any feedback, or indeed if you'd like to appear on an episode and you have a thing you'd like to talk about, please do reach out. A part of the things we want to do is to start building up our community and hearing more voices, mostly to save you all from me. Do have an absolutely wonderful week, and we shall look forward to hopefully speaking to you again in episode 11. And no, I still haven't decided what it's going to be. So, you have a surprise. Take care now.